Okay, let's see who we've got here. Colin Liddell, how are you, sir?
Yeah, hi, Luke. What I really love is jumping on a live stream at 5 o'clock in the morning. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, it gets the blood flowing, doesn't it?
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, what are you talking about now?
There's been another mass shooting, young white man apparently responsible in a Jewish neighborhood in Chicago. So what do you think is the capacity of places like 4chan Poll to, radicalize young men and lead them down a bad path?
Isn't this just an incel phenomenon when you really boil it down? These are all young guys who are unattached, who don't have much prospect of finding a significant other or even getting laid, And so this is probably the inevitable result of that. But still, statistically, is it that significant? Is there that much of it for a country like America? Shouldn't there actually be a lot more?
No. Statistically, it's not significant. I mean, there are 500 times other ways of being murdered rather than some alt-right dude radicalized on 4chan. It's just that one gets far more attention. I remember last week there were like 56 migrants who boiled to death in a truck, and it got very little attention compared to the 20 or so people who were shot up in Uvalde. So I guess it both depends on who's dead and who killed them. If it's a mass shooter, if it's a white guy, then it gets 20 times more news coverage than if it's some coyote smugglers.
Yeah. The news has always been very selective in that way, hasn't it? I mean, this is something that happens all the time. There's news which gets completely ignored, and there's news that doesn't. And there's non-news that fills the airwaves. During much of the Trump presidency, there was one nothing burger after another, wasn't there?
Yeah. All the fake hate crimes. Tell me, you've started a new website, Neokrat. What's going on there?
Well, I've been kind of lumbered with the alt-right for rather too long, and the alt-right was at the time when the alt-right got started. It wasn't really right-wing, but unfortunately the name was alt-right, which, was a bit of a handicap, really, because I think the alt-right the original alt-right, the 2010 alt-right, wanted to look at things in a much more radical and transcendent way. But eventually it got kind of subsumed into this kind of tribal left-right nonsense that dominates so much of the political and metapolitical and philosophical and moral universe. And I've always been pushing against that. And even when I was part of the so-called alt-right, a lot of my work was trying to escape from that crude framing. And so, the site, the Neokrat, is the culmination of that. I want to have content that looks at things in a kind of deep and radical way, but without the heavily restrictive framing of this kind of left-right, tribal, hive-minded, moronic way of thinking.
Mm. And what do you think about the conservative war on the Disney Corporation?
Yeah, this is a reference to a little bit of news about Ben Shapiro. His outfit are trying to branch out from commentary into entertainment and provide more wholesome family entertainment, because the Disney Corporation has been drifting leftwards for a considerable period. And by drifting leftwards, they've probably left a bit of a potential gap in the market. And maybe some sort of organization can then step in and provide the kind of family-friendly, Christian conservative content that a lot of Americans actually want, rather than this woke globalist version of Disney that now seems to dominate. So it could be a good business move, but it would have to be done with skill and a lot of right decisions would have to be made. So that's not necessarily going to happen.
And what do you think of Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis? He's being talked up as a favorite, particularly if Trump doesn't run, to win the Republican nomination in 2024.
Yeah, I've seen DeSantis, and, he just strikes me as a very boring managerial type. Slightly creepy, actually. A bit fake. Probably quite a clever, slick politician. There's just no resonance there. I don't really like the guy. He might be a good guy. He might do good things, but compared to Trump, he seems rather boring. Maybe he'll be able to do Trumpism more efficiently than Trump, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think he's a self-serving type.
So the news media wouldn't allow Richard Spencer to go on Bumble without writing an article about him, but it's interesting how eager Richard Spencer is to, on the one hand, tell the mainstream media he's no longer a white nationalist, but in his own spaces, he'll say, I just care about Aryans. So maybe he's no longer a white nationalist, he's just an Aryan nationalist. Not really sure what's going on.
Yeah, Richard bashing, it's kind of easy to do, but I try to avoid it because, I think Richard is an interesting character. He's a bright guy. He's created a lot of interesting takes on various subjects. He usually says something that's at least witty and occasionally incisive. But I think he's really, he's got his own curse to bear. And he did get sucked into this, the Nazi-tard phase of the alt-right quite heavily. And he's never going to really be allowed to escape that. And of course, it's had all sorts of negative consequences for him financially and socially and so on. And so I think most of the things that Richard has done in the last few years do seem to resemble a kind of damage control or a kind of muddying of the waters. He's trying to make amends in a sense, but he's also trying to obfuscate his past. And I think this is what's probably drawn him very strongly to something as absurd on the face of it as Apollonianism, because this is what he identifies as mainly now, is an Apollonian, as you probably know. And Apollonianism is I think probably for most people on first hearing, it's quite a goofy idea because it basically sounds like he's trying to revive worship of the Greco-Roman god Apollo. And, of course, if you speak to Richard about this, which probably he'll never do because you're in his bad books, he'll probably tell you that it's an extension of his understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy.
Yeah, it's interesting that Spencer has teamed up with Mark Brahman in that whatever you think of Richard Spencer, he's very clear. Like, even if he's being muddled, he's very clear in his... I don't know. I never have a hard time understanding what Richard Spencer's saying. On the other hand, Brahman just does not cohere for me. I mean, I can kind of get it that, like, he basically blames the Jews for almost all the ills of the modern world. But are you able to make heads and tails of Mark Brahman? And do you have any theories on why Richard wants to be joined at the hip with him?
Yeah, that's the problem with Brahman. Brahman, if you listen to little bits and pieces of him, he does come across as a kind of not so obviously in the closet kind of Jew hater. And, if people want to hate the Jews, I guess that's fine. Everybody's entitled to have their the things they like and the things they don't like, and to think what they think about different groups and people and things and so on. But, Spencer... I think one of the reasons Spencer is attracted to Apollonianism is because of its absurdity. He's always going to be seen as a neo-Nazi white nationalist, and so he needs something that's even more kind of goofy and eye-catching than being a neo-Nazi white nationalist. And something like Apollo worship would possibly do that. People would look at that and they say, okay, Richard Spencer, he used to be a neo-Nazi, but now he's just a bit mad. He's a bit of an eccentric. He's gone off the deep end. And then they would probably or possibly think, let's leave this guy alone. He's obviously gone cuckoo. And so that would be one of the utilities of going along with something like Apollonianism. And of course, maybe it's partly inspired by Richard's former friend, Giorgiani, who has his own kind of weird, wacky neo-religion, Prometheanism. So I think there's a lot of funny things going on there, but you've got to look at it from a kind of point of view of the utilities it has for somebody like Richard. And he is trying to live down his past. But of course, if Mark Brahman is anti-Jewish in any way, that's probably likely to increase over time, because that's usually what happens when people are against Jews on the down low. The longer they go on, the more apparent and obsessive that becomes.
And on the other hand, Richard does a near weekly show with Edward Dutton, who's like the opposite of Mark Brahman. Ed Dutton's very clear, doesn't display any animus towards Jews.
That's probably a better direction to go in. But then again, Mark Brahman and Apollonianism, it's got that kind of, wow, what the fuck kind of factor. So I'm not sure that Edward Dutton has that.
Yeah. And what's going on with Jared Taylor these days? Have you been paying any attention?
Yeah. I did an article about Jared Taylor, and he did a video. Basically, if you look at the video and you boil it down, what he's saying is that the sharp rise in LGBTQ, transgenderism, blah, 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 whatever you want to call it, amongst the younger generation is mainly due to the fact that they're scared of being called racist. And so I thought that was a bit funny because, Jared Taylor's been called racist probably more than anybody over the years. So, why isn't he gay yet?
Now, let's just, I don't think we've ever spoken about same-sex marriage. Conservatives have not had an easy time articulating a rational basis to oppose same-sex marriage. Liberals can evoke universal principles of equality, and they just seem to have a much harder time on the rhetorical playing field, while people right of center, they hail much more towards an uneasy feeling about the toppling of traditional forms of identity and traditional forms of organizing a family. But it does seem that the liberal approach has just overwhelmingly won the day, and in rhetorical battles, liberals have a much easier time making the case for why marriage equality is a good thing, while people on the right have a much harder time trying to make an argument why marriage equality is not a good thing. Do you have any thoughts on this argument?
Well, I think gay marriage is a kind of, it has elements of the right and the left, really. First of all, there's the kind of equivalence between gay people marrying and non-gay people marrying. And of course, that sort of equivalence, it sort of harmonizes with the basic ideology of Western liberal society, which is to treat everybody the same. But also, it's a kind of conservative move, marriage, because, gay marriage is a kind of conservatism as well, because most homosexuals back in the day, one of the things that they enjoyed about being gay was the freedom to basically, do what they want and not to be tied down in rather conventional marital relationships. And so there is a conservative element to it as well. But most of the world and almost the entirety of human history has been against it. And I guess, in the long run, I don't think it's going to really subsist. If you come back to Earth 1,000 years later, will there still be gay marriage? I kind of doubt that.
Let me take it up a notch. People on the right feel like they're walking around with a left wing boot on their neck. That all the major institutions and all the ways that we're supposed to argue and discuss public issues in public are dominated by the liberal left. Do you think that's a fair perception? And do you notice, is that a reality that you notice as well?
I think that's a very easy conclusion to come to, especially in the Anglosphere countries, in Britain and America, Australia too, no doubt. It does seem like a lot of this gay liberation, homosexual equality, gay marriage, transgenderism is being pushed on us, not just by the educational and the academic institutions, but also by a lot of the corporate institutions. Most of the major political parties are more or less going along with it. So this is something that's almost guaranteed to predispose people to increasingly conspiratorial thinking, and they're going to start thinking there's some evil conspiracy to destroy the family and to destroy the white race and to bring down the West. But on the other hand, there are also reasons why this would be happening, why this is being pushed. There is a kind of ideological consistency to this. I mean, most people who are listening to this show, no doubt, live in liberal societies that have been developing their ideology for decades now, and that ideology is basically equality, and everybody's more or less the same, and everybody should have the same kind of breaks and so on. And if you think about a gay person growing up in a society which is quite conservative and quite conventional, they are going to feel that they are being discriminated against. And so there is a kind of grim logic to what the West is doing, whether you agree with it or, like me, don't agree with it. There is a kind of grim logic to that.
What do you think of Tucker Carlson? Have you paid him any mind?
Every time I tune into the Luke Ford show, I'm confronted with this man. I don't know what to make of Tucker yet. I think he says a lot of things that make sense, but then again, there's something a bit off about him. I can't help thinking. Something that doesn't quite ring true. And one of the things that stands out about Tucker is he's actually quite against the war in the Ukraine. He wants America to basically just like wash its hands and just let Putin get up to what he wants to get up to, which is a kind of interesting viewpoint. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, it's an interesting viewpoint for a kind of mainstream American media corporation to take. There is a kind of logic to America being involved and trying to contain Putin. And in a way, America is kind of benefiting from Putin's aggression as well.
And is there anything else about the war in Ukraine that has kept your attention over the past few weeks, as Russia seems to be doing to be more effective in the campaign than they were initially?
When you say Russia, you mean Muscovy, don't you? Because everybody tries to see things in a very bipolar way. This seems to be an inherent characteristic of most people. They see things in a very, very bipolar way. They don't have that kind of Zen mind that people like me have developed that can sort of transcend that kind of crude framing. You're supposed to be a Zelensky fanatic or a kind of complete Putin shill. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. The way to see this conflict is as a kind of Russian civil war. I mean, I think Ukraine is Russian. I think it is essentially part of Russia. But the thing is, Russia is not a completely homogeneous, one-size-fits-all kind of country. Russia has a lot of variety within it. There is a kind of multipolarity inherent in Russia. And of course, that's natural because Russia is this huge country. It's been a vast, huge country for a long time. And there are a lot of different poles within Russia. There's a lot of tension, for example, between Moscow and Leningrad. And there's all sorts of things that are influenced by that. And then, of course, you have another Russia, which is Belorussia. And you could actually quite comfortably divide Russia up into lots of little Russias. And Ukraine is one of those little Russias, and it wants to go down a much more multipolar route of being Russian. And that's what this is really about. And of course, the over-centralized Putinist state is a reaction to past history, so a reaction to, the early history of medieval Russia, where the country was viciously attacked by very violent and oppressive forces from the east. And so that essentially created the Tsarist state, which was this very unipolar form of Russia. And then later on, Russia got into all sorts of tangles with various European nations like Napoleonic France. And of course, later, the Germans in the First World War and the Second World War. And so the idea of a heavily centralized, militarized Russia kind of made sense within that kind of historical framing. But for long periods of its time, Russia has not really been seriously threatened. And right now, I don't think Russia is being seriously threatened. I don't think Russia would ever be invaded by NATO. NATO is strictly a defensive alliance. It's made up of lots of cute, cuddly nations like Belgium and Norway and so on. These are not the kind of countries that go around starting blitzkriegs.
And how has Japan positioned itself? I assume Japan has just stayed with its ally, the United States, vis-a-vis the Ukraine conflict, or has it stood apart from the U.S.?
I think that Japan does lip service. They do what they think they should do to stay in with who they think they should stay in with. And so they will say, yeah, America, we agree with you about this. Yeah, naughty old Putin. But they won't really step up and do that much to help out the Ukraine. They might make a few token gestures. That's more or less what they're doing. Likewise with the Chinese, they like to keep in with the Chinese. They don't want to piss the Chinese off too much. And they don't want to piss Putin off too much. And so if they think the Americans really want them to do something, they'll try to maybe edge a little closer. But once the pressure's off, they'll just let it slide.
And how's inflation and economic issues going over in Japan right now? Is the country in turmoil, or is there a stiff upper lip and let's just get on with it attitude?
Well, Japan is fiscally and economically, Japan tends to be a bit more conservative. And so, like, when we had the COVID crisis, they didn't spend a lot of money they didn't have, like other countries did, which maybe they had to do, I don't know. But the Japanese were very reluctant for the government to come in and start bailing everybody out and doing things like that. So they usually run a tighter monetary policy. And so inflation is not too bad from what I can see.
And how would you describe Pill Eater?
Yeah, Pill Eater. Yeah, he's a character. He's an interesting guy. He's obviously quite smart. Sometimes I think he needs to have a bit more of a focus. But, he comes up with very, good takes on certain things from time to time. So, yeah, I like Pill Eater. Find his content at least amusing and often quite interesting.
And you were shown to be right in another prediction that Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson would stay in power. Do you have any thoughts on Bojo?
Yeah, it's really easy to criticise a British Prime Minister. Whoever the Prime Minister of Britain is, they're going to have a lot of weak points because of the system they have to exist within. But I don't think Boris has really shat the bed yet. I mean, I don't think he's really fucked up in a major way. He more or less got Brexit done. He's trying to take care of this kind of Northern Ireland protocol, which is a rather awkward leftover from the Brexit negotiations. He's even trying to do something about illegal immigration with this Rwanda scheme, which is being fought against tooth and nail by the left. And so I think he's genuinely trying to do things that the voters more or less want him to do. There's also been a lot of legal immigration, apparently, so he hasn't really done much against that. But of course, for somebody like Boris, his main concern is the economy and the National Health Service. Those are probably his two most important priorities. If the economy starts to suffer and if the National Health Service has serious problems, that's going to be politically very, very toxic. And so those are his main concerns. So he knows that the British voters will blame him most for a weak economy and for anything that goes wrong with the National Health Service. So that's what he's really focused on. And that really limits what he can do about something like legal immigration, because even though most British people in their hearts want less immigration, they probably would blame anybody who restricted immigration if that led to the economy going downhill.
And are there any Japanese politicians we should be particularly aware of?
No, not yet. Don't bother. They'll all be gone soon and replaced by equally bland clones.
And Abe is the name of a former prime minister who remains in the back of my head. Does he still wield significant power behind the scenes?
I presume he does, because most Japanese politicians are like bad farts that don't go away. They kind of linger in the background, and so I think Abe is definitely in that category.
And Chris Roberts, who was Jared Taylor's assistant, 29, suddenly died. I would assume a drug overdose, but I have no idea. Any thoughts on the passing of Chris Roberts?
Yeah, he wrote for my former site, Affirmative Right, under one of his many pen names. He was quite a good writer. Of course, I didn't know he was Chris Roberts. And so this is a guy, again, this is like one of the patterns you often see with the alt-right and the dissident right. He was a kind of quasi-white. This was a guy who had a Chilean father, and so he was technically, half Hispanic at least. And so this is somebody growing up in America who has a bit of a foreign background. That's the kind of person that's probably going to have exaggerated identity issues, and a lot of the people in the alt-right kind of fit into that category. So when I heard about that aspect of Chris Roberts, I thought, okay, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, there's kind of three elements that repeatedly crop up in the alt-right, and this kind of quasi or sub-whiteness is one of them. Of course, there's a kind of gay element as well. And a lot of the people attracted to the alt-right are quite short, I've noticed as well. So those are three things that I see again and again. And Chris Roberts, or whatever his real name is, I think it's Rojas, he was in at least one of those categories. I'm not sure if he was in the other two categories. But he had some sort of involvement with the alt-right when it was at its height. And then when it kind of blew up a bit in 2017, thanks to, people like Spencer and Unite the Right and all this stuff, and Heather Heyer dying of whatever cause she died of. And when it kind of blew up, he seemed to step back a bit. And I believe in 2019, he headed out to Chile, and he was going to become a Chilean at that point. And then after a few more months, he headed back to America and started to become Jared Taylor's right-hand man. So if you think about the kind of trajectory there, it seems a little bumpy, a little uneven, a little confused. It suggests that there might have been some kind of psychological turmoil involved. And so that would lead you to suspect, in addition to drug addiction, possibly suicide as well. But we don't really know at this point what was the cause of him dying.
What do you think of the obsession in the alt-right with who glows, like who's a Fed, who's a federal informant?
Yeah, I think it's understandable, really, because I think about, half the people in the alt-right are probably on some sort of government payroll, whether in Washington or Moscow.
And I think it speaks to the widespread insecurity on the alt-right, because I noticed the same thing in the pornography industry. So when I was writing on the pornography industry, it kind of existed in that netherworld between the legal and the illegal. And so there was great fear of government intervention to shut them down. And so there's widespread discussion of who or who is not likely to be a police informant or a law enforcement informant. So I think it speaks to the insecure, suspicious, even paranoid personality that tends to dominate dissident societies, whether it's the pornography industry or far right politics. And I assume you'd find much of the same sort of paranoia on the far left.
Well, let's see. A lot of people on the alternative right are technically paranoid. One of the kind of key things they believe in, a lot of people on the alternative right, is that there's somebody trying to kill the white race and destroy Western civilization. This isn't just like, it's just happening by chance. They believe that it's being driven and guided by malevolent actors. So they have a paranoid mind frame to begin with. And so when you start out being a paranoid person and you're in an organization made up of paranoid people, then there's going to be a lot of like who's really one of us and who isn't, who's a Fed and who isn't, who's a secret Jew and who isn't. So this is just part and parcel of the alt-right. There's all sorts of paranoid people in that movement.
And how did you obtain the Zen mindset? It sounds even better than the gorilla mindset hawked by Mike Sudovich.
I think it's because it's not just because I live in Japan. I don't think that's. I think I always had a Zen mind. I was always, probably because of my family background as well. Just growing up and with brothers and hearing how stupid people can be. Like in my family, people would argue about really stupid things. And I was actually the youngest, and so I kind of became much more detached, looking at it as if from above, and seeing how stupid other people were, how petty they were in their emotions, and how they exaggerated things unbelievably, and so I just sort of developed that way of just like stepping back and just looking at everything as if I wasn't really there. And so I think that's the origin of my Zen mind, to be honest. It's not just because I've lived in the Orient for many years and, of course, visited many Zen temples and gone to shrines in the mountains and meditated and been whacked with a bamboo stick.
And how's Millennial Woes doing these days? He always seems a little bit mopey and depressed.
Yeah, Millennial Woes. Such promise wasted. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he did a podcast just the other day on some channel called Scrumpy Monkey on YouTube. So I might go and have a listen to that later, see if he says anything different. But honestly, a lot of these alt-right personalities, when you go and tune into them again, it's basically like deja vu. It's like, oh yeah, I've heard this, I've heard all this before, I've heard this line before, I've heard this narrative before. It's like a time warp. Millennial Woes his problem is he's just not a happy person, and he never will be, and he never was, and some people, I think some people are just born lucky. They're naturally quite cheerful. They enjoy life. Whatever happens to them, bad things, good things, whatever happens to them, they're still bubbling over, and they're enjoying life, and they have a positive attitude to what's going on. And some people are the opposite. Their happiness level is set at a lower rate. And so they tend to be depressed more easily. They tend to take things more negatively. And I think Millennial Woes is probably one of those type of people. I would say my old friend Andy Nowicki is probably a bit like that. I'd say that Luke Ford is probably a more cheerful type of person. I could be wrong about that, but that's just my impression from how you conduct yourself. And I certainly feel that I'm like that. I feel I'm usually quite a cheerful person. Things don't really get me down too much, no matter how bad they are. I just I can find some sort of enjoyment or interest in most things. And I don't mope and get morose and, stare into my navel and all that rubbish.
I notice a lot of people I know kind of had their minds blown by their experience with the alt-right. They had the sensation that they got to age 25, 30, 40, and then suddenly, realized that much of what they'd been told were a bunch of lies, and that there are, say, significant group differences between peoples, and that Jews exercise a lot of influence in some areas. And what I'm disappointed to see happen is that they stay there, they get stuck there like an insect stuck in amber, and they don't then apply that same skepticism to further distant right thinking, but it just seems to extend, so that now I'm keeping an eye on this mass shooting event in Highland Park near Chicago, and the immediate response by a lot of people who are political dissidents is that this is a setup. This is the government arranging something so that they can crack down on guns, and if the government comes in with some restrictions to try to deal with COVID or any other putative emergency, that this just shows the nefarious nature of the elite. And so, do you have any thoughts on how people kind of seem to get stuck in particular dissident thinking, and then they just keep going dissident? So all sorts of events that seem fairly settled by historians, they now understand it as the result of a Jewish conspiracy or a Freemason conspiracy, or they can't seem to escape the amber of the dissident mindset.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. You have organizations like the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Institution, whatever it's called, and of course there's many other organizations as well, and they're all trying to fight extremism, to de-radicalize people, etc., to shut down racism and so on, and anti-Semitism, and all these organizations are clearly failing. I think people are becoming much more kind of paranoid. Maybe the people are becoming less racist, but they're becoming more anti-Semitic. I'd say that seems to be a pattern as well. And so all this de-radicalization seems to be failing. And there are reasons for that. And of course, the main reason for that is the kind of patterns of behavior that you just described. And why do people evolve in that way? Or I shouldn't use the term evolve, should I? Why do people de-evolve in that way? And of course, it's because the world doesn't make sense to them. The world is too complicated. There's things which are quite hard to explain. I mean, one of the things you hear people often talking about is how many non-whites are in adverts, or how many mixed race couples are in advertising and TV commercials. And it's very, very hard for people to come up with a plausible reason for that doesn't involve some kind of malevolent plot. You have rapid population changes. People then say, "Oh, that's the great replacement," and then they come up with the idea that it's all been done to them, rather than being the natural result of liberal individualism and allowing women to choose what to do with their lives. So there are a lot of things that fuel this kind of paranoid way of thinking. This is what the alt-right ultimately became after its very bright beginnings. This is what it was co-opted by these very regressive forces, and it became an expression of this kind of weird mindset. And QAnon is another thing that that gave vent to it, and it does seem to be becoming culturally ascendant in certain ways. You could even say that people like Tucker Carlson feed into it and draw energy from it. It actually has, or is starting to impact society on a much more normie level.
And similar to this, I noticed many people from distant right politics have found that it's much more socially acceptable to pose behind titles like trad Catholic or just base Christian. That is definitely more socially acceptable than to say you're alt-right, but it seems such a transparent pose. I mean, because there's very little that seems to be authentically Catholic about a Nick Fuentes, for example.
Yeah, it's very convenient to to wrap it all up in a kind of religious wrapper. And obviously people like Nick Fuentes have pioneered this method with a degree of success. I mean, somebody like Nick Fuentes, he just doesn't strike me as a religious type, but obviously by pretending to be a Christian, it has a lot of utility for his kind of dissident viewpoints. He can almost pretend to be a normal person. He can pretend to be somebody who has a resonance with the vast majority of Americans who also pretend to be Christians.
And I'm thinking you also get to avoid sex or too much human contact or bonding with people. It's a useful pose, I would expect, if you're kind of repelled at the idea of having sex with women.
Yeah, this is probably what gave him the idea in the first place. I mean, he's a kind of charismatic young guy, and so everybody's thinking, he must have a girlfriend. And there was that thing some years ago where he was supposed to have a relationship with Kathy Zhu, and of course nothing was happening. Absolutely nothing. He was much more interested in Catboy Cameo or whatever, And so this kind of I'm a Christian, I'm a good boy, I'm a good Catholic boy shtick. This is perfect for deflecting from those awkward questions. And so Christian nationalism, Christian Catholic, conservative, all that stuff, it's ideal for somebody like Nick Fuentes, and it's also ideal for people who want to be anti-Semitic. I mean, E. Michael Jones did a lot of pioneering work there. It's just a convoluted way of being a Nazi, really.
Yeah. And have you experienced like a creative burst from starting a new site and having a more free direction? I know that when I've got stuck in certain genres, that it's very stultifying over time, and then breaking out of that has just been exciting.
I just wanted to have a site that I could use to quickly publish things on for my other various blog sites, because I've got a history site, and I had a news site, Trad News, and I thought, it's silly having separate sites. It's best to have one site. And also I wanted a site that I could repost interesting content on from around the internet, like interesting Luke Ford videos, for example, and pieces and by other people. And of course, a lot of the content now is actually, is video, it is podcast, it's audio. And so the site is kind of optimized for reposting videos and audio from other sites, and for posting articles as well, of course, for me and other people. And so it's less work as well. So there's more content, there's less work for me. So it's kind of a win-win situation.
How do you maintain such a consistent work ethic? Because for every Colin Liddell out there with a consistent work ethic in this sphere, there are 100 people who burn out much quicker.
Well, it's a lot easier for me to write than most people. I know what, I can size things up. I know what the points are that should be made, and, in what order to put them and what to leave out. And it just, it's quite a quick process for me to write something. Almost all my articles I just write in one sitting and then post them straight away with one or two typos, and take out the typos and maybe quickly make an audio-visual version and, multi-platform it. I just do it not for the money, not for the fame, because I get very little of either. I just do it because I want to, like you, I want to express a few ideas. I want to have my say. And if people want to read it and follow it and maybe contribute in some way with their own content, that's fine. Just trying to create a nice, healthy space for ideas, and to break away from this kind of tribal, monkeys throwing shit kind of show that seems to dominate so much of contemporary discourse.
And there are a lot more options for increasingly free discussion online now, with the rise of Odyssey and with BitChute and with Rumble. So we're not as squelched discussing distant ideas as it was greatly feared 3 or 2 or even a year ago.
Yeah, even on mainstream platforms, you can still discuss quite, radical and edgy ideas, as long as you avoid the obvious pitfalls. Ideas can be expressed quite calmly. You don't have to be emotional. You don't have to be frothing at the mouth. You can talk about all sorts of things still on mainstream social media.